We're on. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We'll start with 742 tonight. At 742, When Upon Life's Billows. And we'll sing all three on this one. When upon life's billows you are tempest. Great. Seems to be on. So let's open up to Mark chapter 8. So we're going to continue spending our time. That's Mark chapter 8. Now here, as we've been saying, we're continuing to look at the record of the public ministry of Jesus. Now, more specifically, what we find in this chapter is another record of some of the miracles that Jesus performed. This chapter began with the feeding of the 4,000 people that Jesus fed with 7 loaves of bread and a few small fish. That was verses 1 through 9 of this chapter. Then in verses 10 through 21, Mark records some more information about Jesus' dealings with the Pharisees and with his own apostles, who, even with the feeding of the 4,000 and shortly before that the feeding of the 5,000, they still failed to understand what the miracles of Jesus indicated about Jesus. And since that's the case, that they had failed to understand what those miracles indicated, it is for this reason that among the things Jesus asked his own apostles is the question we see in verse 18 of this chapter. Lost my place. There we go. Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? Now, as we see there, we've already looked at this verse. We did last week. But Jesus asked that question. Having eyes, do you not see? And then followed by the question in verse 21, do you not yet understand? So part of what Mark is bringing to the forefront at this point in the chapter is this idea of seeing. So it's that thing of seeing not with your eyes, but with understanding and seeing with what one person has called your spiritual eyes, rather than just your physical eyes. Now, I draw our attention to that because beginning in verse 22, these things come to the forefront. These ideas of seeing and understanding come to the forefront. There in verse 22, where Mark records, he writes, "And they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him." We'll pause with that. So here in verse 22, we have another one of these, as I like to call them, stage-setting verses, where Mark presents to us something that's going on. Now, what's happening here in verse 22? And asked him to touch him. Why touch him? What are they expecting here? They want him to be healed. One thing we've looked at as we've looked at some of these miracles of Jesus is that a lot of what they have in common is that they involve this physical touch. Now, people have become aware of this, that Jesus could heal someone just by touching them. Nothing more. So this is why they bring this blind man. They know what Jesus can do. What the text says, at least the New American Standard, has the word they implored him to touch him. Does everyone have the word implored there? Begged. Okay. That's what the word implored means. It's they're begging him to touch him because they know what that will accomplish, the healing of this man. But where this takes place is here at this place called Bethsaida. So we need to understand something about that place. This place, Bethsaida, it was a village on the northern side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, something else we know about Bethsaida from John chapter 1, verse 44, this was probably the birthplace of the apostles Andrew, Peter, and Philip, because they came from there when we look at John chapter 1. Now, what we also know about Bethsaida is that it was near here where Jesus fed the 5,000 back in Mark chapter 6. We also read about that in Luke chapter 9. But Mark's point of emphasis here is not about what Bethsaida was all about. He's just telling us here's where this situation took place. This is where Jesus arrived to with his apostles after he'd been where he previously had been, and they bring this blind man to Jesus in order that Jesus might touch him. That's what the text says. Now, since that's true, what we should also understand here is that what these people were asking to do, as we've already established, is Jesus to heal this man from his blindness, and again, just by touching him. And so we're reminded that touch was one of the major features of the healing miracles of Jesus. Anything else on verse 22? All right. So again, verse 22 is one of those stage-setting verses that presents to us some information about what Mark is going to record next. But more specifically, verse 22 sets the stage for what Mark will go on to record in verses 23 through 26, where he makes really 2 points about how Jesus went about healing this man from his physical blindness. But more importantly than that, what Jesus healed this man from was his spiritual blindness, and we'll talk about that. But again, there's 2 points. The first point Mark makes in verses 23 and 24 is that the blind man did not first see clearly. The second point Mark makes in verses 25 and 26 is that the blind man did later see clearly. Now, these are important points that I hope we're going to see as we work through verses 23 through 26 tonight. But after looking at these things, what we will learn from these verses in application is that even today, Jesus helps us to see clearly. Because that's the idea we're going to be looking at, is this idea of seeing clearly as it ties in with understanding. So let's listen to what Mark records in verses 23 through 26, and then we'll look at these points. So again, Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 23, we read, "Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, 'Do you see anything?' And he looked up and said, 'I see men, for I see them like trees walking around.' Then again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, 'Do not even enter the village.'" Okay, so this story is all about this blind man and how Jesus went about healing him. But there's 2 points that deal with this idea of seeing clearly. So first, the blind man did not see clearly. But this point is introduced with what Jesus does in verse 23. So it's been requested that Jesus touch him, but what does Jesus do here in verse 23? Okay, but what does he do first? Okay, so he takes him out of the village. That's one of the first things we read there. Now, why would he do that? Okay, confidentially is a good word to use there. Yeah, so he's taking him away from the public view of everything. And then he does what is described here, followed by the question we read here. So he's taking the man out of public view in order to do what he's going to do. Now, furthermore, something else we should understand here is that what Jesus does here is very similar to what he did with the deaf man back in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. So what does Jesus do here? We'll get to the question here in a minute, but what does he do? He spit on his eyes.
You know, I mean, so it's kind of like the previous time, it's like, I don't think it really want to kind of like showing that.
Well, that might be part of the privateness of it. So yes, he spits on his eyes. Now, something we looked at when we talked about the deaf man, this wasn't entirely foreign. It was part of some medical procedures of the time, sometimes associated with magic. But yes, this is what Jesus does, is he spits on the man's eyes. That's what the text says. But even though that's what the text says, it's not, he may have spit on his hands and then applied the saliva. But the most obvious thing here is that he did spit directly into the man's eyes. But Jesus is still applying the same technique that he did with the deaf man. Spit, saliva. So what does he ask after he does this? Can you see anything? Do you see anything? That's the question. So, as the question of Jesus suggests, after doing what he's done, he's now asking the man, can you see? I'm simplifying it a little bit. Now, does Jesus know the answer to this question? Yeah, we can assume that he does. So why ask it? If he already knows the answer, why would Jesus ask the question? Okay, well, okay, we'll get to that here in just a minute. So, I mean, we do learn some things about the blind man here. But the question we're asking right now is, why would Jesus ask this question if he already knows the answer? Okay, wants the blind man to recognize that he can't see. Any other ideas? What's that, Andrew? Say that again. That might be the case. Okay, it's about steps. There are steps here. We're seeing that. But he asked this question, do you see anything? Now, what did Jesus ask his apostles back in verse 18? That first question. Do you see? He's asking the same question of this blind man. Do you see? So Jesus' question is going beyond, can you physically see? There's some spiritual aspects to this question as well. Can you see anything? Now, of course, the man's going to take it literally because of what's going on, and Jesus doesn't fault him for that. Go ahead, Elaine. Right. That might be the case. But this is an important question. Do you see anything? There's spiritual aspects to this question, and Elaine put it well. Jesus is leading him in a certain direction. This is more than just about curing this man from his blindness, physical blindness. Anything else on verse 23? Mm-hmm. That's true. We're not going to see that statement here, but faith is definitely involved. Anything else on verse 23? What do you mean clarify what he's doing? I mean, yeah, he is getting him to think about what Jesus is doing for him, but part of what Mark has been doing in chapter 8 is helping people to recognize something about what these miracles indicated about Jesus. So that's what Jesus is really wanting this man to see. Not can you see what's around you, but can you see who Jesus is? That's where this question is coming from. Do you see anything? Now the man, he's still taking this literally. Again, Jesus is not faulting him for that, but Jesus is leading him to a conclusion. So anything else on verse 23? Okay. And so we have the man's response in verse 24. What does he say? I see people, but they look like trees walking. So what does it say about the man's sight at this point? It's not 2020. It's not fully regained yet. Now, does that mean Jesus has come up short on his miracle? Okay, why not? Okay, seeing more than he did before, that's true. Any other ideas as to why Jesus' miracle has not come up short? Now, the man, go ahead. Okay. So let's explore that. What's that reason why it's not? Might say it's the man. Maybe. We don't know. But one thing we do know is that Jesus' miracle has not come up short. Again, we have to look at the context to try to find one reason why Jesus is doing this in the way that he is. From the context, verse 18, having eyes do you not see? He's helping this man to see, not just physically, but also spiritually. But he's doing this in steps. It's the same thing Jesus has been doing with his apostles for the last several chapters, helping them to see who Jesus really is. So this blind man is basically an illustration for the apostles of what he's trying to help them to do. So yes, this man has not fully regained his sight. He sees somewhat, but as the man puts it, they look like trees to him, just walking around. So part of Jesus' purpose in performing this miracle was so that the man might not only gain his physical sight, but that he might be brought to a full and clear picture of who Jesus is. So this miracle begins with this man only being able to see partially rather than fully. Anything else on verse 24? All right. So putting verses 23 and 24, the point here about the blind man is that the blind man did not first see clearly. He could not yet completely see. How do we know that? Well, because people look like trees walking around. But Jesus is doing this on purpose. He intended for the man to begin only partially seeing in order to begin having that spiritual sight. So that brings us into verses 25 and 26. The man has said what he said. What does Jesus do in verse 25? What does that mean that he laid his hands on him? What was the original request? Okay, but we're looking at this idea of laying his hands on him. What was the request back in verse 22? Touch him. So he's done that. He has touched him. But now here in verse 25, it's touched him a second time. So Jesus has fulfilled the request as far as touching goes. But after he does the touching, what happens here in verse 25? Okay. How does that contrast with what his sight was originally like? People still looking like trees? No. He's got his full sight back. He's now able to see clearly. Now, one reason we know the idea of seeing clearly is here because that phrase, looked intently that the New American Standard has, comes from a word that carries with it the idea of being able to see clearly. The 20/20 vision. The man who was blind could now see clearly. So that's why Mark adds this word restored. Now, the word restored is something we're familiar with. What does it mean when something is restored? Brought back to its original condition. How does that apply here? He had good vision again. His eyes were restored back to their original condition. So this does give us some indications that maybe he wasn't blind his whole life. But again, that's a maybe. But yes, his sight was back. It had undergone a complete restoration, brought back to their original condition what they were intended to be. People didn't look like trees anymore. They looked like people. So it's at this point that the miracle Jesus was performing was now complete. Because this man had gone from being completely blind to completely being able to see everything clearly. Questions or comments on verse 25? All right. So verse 26, what does Jesus do? You have the word city there? Or village? Village, okay. So he sends him home, but adds this instruction, do not even enter the village. What's the village we're talking about? Verse 22. Bethsaida. So he tells him, don't go back to Bethsaida. Why add that instruction? He taken him out. Oh. Okay, he didn't want it spread. We've seen that with a lot of the miracles. Don't tell anyone. Now, he doesn't say don't tell anyone. He just tells them don't go back into the village. But we might assume the reason is don't go tell all these people. Yours has don't tell anyone? Or tell anyone in the town. What version are you reading, Shannon? No, New King James got it wrong, folks. I'm sorry. Okay. Now, I don't know why the New King James records it that way, because the instruction here is do not enter the village. The language of don't tell anyone doesn't come up in this case. We can say it's implied because we've seen that before, but the text does not specifically say it. Because Jesus, as we've already discussed before, Jesus isn't after celebrity. He's not looking to be popular. But that has come because even when Jesus told them not to, people were still spreading the news. But Mark doesn't record that information for us. He just adds the instruction, do not even enter the village. Go home. Don't go back to this village. Anything else on verse 26? All right. So putting verses 25 and 26 together, the point we should see about the blind man from these verses is that the blind man did later see clearly. Now in these verses, Mark has shown that after Jesus touched this man a second time and did so on his eyes, the man completely regained his sight. But again, the purpose of this miracle was not just for the purpose it brought, or the restoration it brought, but the purpose of this miracle was so that the man might see clearly who Jesus is. So it's for this reason that Jesus began this miracle completed this miracle by completely restoring this man's sight, when he did so only partially at the beginning. It's the steps. But something else we might be able to suggest is that Jesus did not perform this miracle to bring himself more of a celebrity status, but rather to just help this man understand who he is. Again, we know that because he told them don't go back to the village. So when we put all these verses together, verses 22 through 26, this short section, the point we should be left with is that Jesus healed a blind man. It's really that simple. But why? To help this man see clearly who he is. At first, the man did not see clearly. He later would see clearly. So that's the application to us. Jesus helps us to see clearly. As has been mentioned, what Jesus was doing in healing this man from his physical blindness, he was also healing this man from spiritual blindness. Today, Jesus does the same. He heals us from spiritual blindness. As he did with this man, he might heal us from our spiritual blindness in steps, where we gradually come to a recognition of who Jesus is. Doesn't always happen overnight. But if Jesus is going to heal us from that spiritual blindness, we, like the man in this story, must be willing to let Jesus take us by the hand. Now, we didn't really touch on that, but this man allowed Jesus to take him. We have to do the same. Let Jesus take us to where he wants us to be so that we can be healed from spiritual blindness. Now, what these verses also show us is that when Jesus does take us to where he wants us to be, he might tell us not to go back from where we came from. Now, I bring that up because part of what the scriptures teach is that if we are truly going to follow Jesus, we're going to have to leave some things behind, including our family in some cases. So we have to ask ourselves, will we allow Jesus to heal us from spiritual blindness and help us to see clearly? Any other questions or comments? All righty. Dean, will you close us tonight?